Hello and welcome to our debate tonight. We're here at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the Old Theatre with a large audience of interested members of the public and students from the London School of Economics too. Our motion is Britain should remain within the EU. You of course can join the debate on Twitter. Use the hashtag #LSE Europe. And it is fair to say Britain's relationship with Europe is a very unsettled one right now. The Eurozone is struggling to stay intact. To do so, there's the prospect of fast and deep integration, banking union, fiscal union, political union, and if it all happens, Britain's relationship with the European Union will clearly be affected. You may take one of many, many different views on the way to go from here, from the most sceptic to the most enthusiastic. We have cut the cake today by slicing it between the ins and the outs. But as chairperson, I am interpreting our motion tonight to imply the following. You vote yes, you want to stay in. You may believe you want to renegotiate, but notwithstanding the result of that renegotiation, you would rather stay in than come out. You vote no if you would come out if the renegotiation failed. So we'll have a call of voices and a show of hands. If there were a referendum tomorrow, if you would like to stay in, shout yay. Yay! If you would like to leave in a referendum tomorrow, shout nay. Nay! Yays, show your hands. Nays, show your hands. Oh, I would say it's overwhelmingly positive in the sense of voting yes rather than no. Right, we're going to vote again after the debate. We'll see whether that has changed. Now, that debate, it is asymmetric. We have one person proposing the case for staying in. He'll answer the arguments put to him by a panel of critics, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and we'll start here.
My name's Roger Helmer. I'm a member of the European Parliament representing the United Kingdom Independence Party and also representing the East Midlands, although for many years I was a Conservative member of the European Parliament until I moved across to UKIP. The position I take is that Britain would be better off out.
My name is Helen Szamuely. I'm not a politician. I'm head of research at the Bruges Group, which is a think tank, and I'm also an independent blogger. My position on it is very simple. We should negotiate our way out tomorrow.
I'm Mark Reckless. I'm the Conservative MP for Rochester and Strood. I was for some years UK economist for Warburgs and author of the Euro Bad for Business. I'm now chairman of the campaign for an independent Britain, and I believe we'd be better off as an independent country, trading with Europe, but governing ourselves.
And finally, our last and perhaps not quite so sceptical panel member.
That's right. I'm George Eustice. I'm the Member of Parliament for Camborne and Redruth. My first job in politics about 12 years ago was working for the anti-Euro No campaign in the UK, which campaigned to stay in the European Union but not join the Euro. My view now is that we should stay in the European Union but under new terms, and it's now time to take stock, given the crisis in the Eurozone, and renegotiate our position in Europe.
And just to be absolutely clear, in the event of a failure of a renegotiation, so you didn't get your way, you would...
Well, clearly, if you think that the status quo is not acceptable, then you would vote to come out.
Right, okay, that's it. We've got two Conservative MPs, a UKIP member and one non-politician. We'll start with the man who's going to make the case for staying in. He's Sir Stephen Wall, Tony Blair's former EU advisor. You're a brave man, Sir Stephen. It's not the most popular cause. The polls show the public are against you. Just tell us a little about your career, because you know quite a lot about this institution.
Well, professionally, I came to it in the 1980s as a Foreign Office official working for Margaret Thatcher when she was trying to, quote, get our money back. I worked for John Major. I was with him at Maastricht, the treaty that gave rise to the single currency. And then I had 5 years as Britain's ambassador to the European Union in Brussels, thinking not so much we're about to become a superstate, but how fragile the relationships were between the countries of the European Union at that time.
Right, so Stephen Wall is going to be making the case for the motion that we should stay within the EU. We've divided the debate into two, politics and economics. Each half gives Sir Stephen 90 seconds or so to set out his case unchallenged, and then we will essentially let the panel rebut. Politics first, Sir Stephen.
It's referendum day, and I'm at the polling booth, and I shall vote to stay in. Of course, I'm relieved that we, Britain, play a decisive part in the world's largest economic organisation, 500 million people, both a market for us and a powerful means of exercising economic influence in the world. But for me, it's the politics that count. We all of us as member states have strong national interests. And the European Union is, I believe, still the best means we have among 27 neighbouring countries of managing those potentially conflicting interests so that they do not get dangerously out of hand. We have a framework of rules which mean that the biggest cannot bully the smallest, that we compete fairly, that brings those who misbehave back into line. Above all, to be a member of the European Union, you have to be a genuine democracy. So beyond our differences, there are value systems which unite us. We helped Spain and Portugal to achieve democratic stability after years of fascism. We did the same for Eastern Europe after half a century of communist dictatorship. And the unprecedented peace that we've enjoyed in Western Europe didn't happen by chance, and I do not believe that its continuation can be counted on through complacency. So in my view, the European Union is still the best vehicle we have for peaceful, prosperous stability, and I will vote to stay in for my safety's sake.
So Stephen, thank you very much indeed. I want to go straight on to getting some comments about that. We've heard about democracy, stability, decades of peace, and a union that stops the big bullying the smallest. Roger.
Well, I'm impressed to hear that the union stops the biggest bullying the smallest. I shall go and tell them in Athens, and I'm sure they'll be deeply impressed. But I really want to take up your point about peace. Peace in Europe has not been kept by the European Union. It's been kept by the Transatlantic Alliance, by NATO, by mutually assured destruction, by 100,000 American GIs in Germany. And the Berlin Wall didn't come down because the Commission did something clever. It came down because of the courage and determination of people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and possibly Pope John Paul.
Well, I think frankly, the Berlin Wall came down partly because of the brave actions of the people of Germany and the people of countries of Eastern Europe. But, of course, I agree with you about the importance of NATO, but this isn't just about defence in that sense. It is about having stability. And I do not myself believe that without the prospect of joining the European Union, we could have counted on the transition of the countries of Eastern and Central Europe to the kind of democracy we see today.
Helen.
Well, I'd like to take up fairly swiftly 2 points. One is that the business about all the countries in the European Union being democracies was one that came up first when the negotiations were about Britain joining, and that was the argument for the common market. To which the counter-argument was, yes, but the structure itself is not democratic, and that counter-argument still applies.
Well, if you want a pure democratic system, then you should have a federal system, which successive governments of this country have turned their face against. Short of that, you have a system in which the elected members of Parliament, who are members of governments, serve on the Council of Ministers, and the Council of Ministers shares with the European Parliament, directly elected, the power to make legislation. Now, okay, you have other institutions, and notably the European Commission, with the power to propose legislation.
In fact, it's the only one that has the power to propose legislation.
And I firmly believe that unique construction accounts for the success of the European Union, because it does mean that you've got a body, however flawed, and all institutions are flawed, which does have an interest of the European Union as a whole at
But from
heart.
Britain's point of view, if we are outvoted on the Council of Ministers, no matter, even if there have been numerous occasions in which all parties agreed on a certain attitude and a certain course of action, outvoted on the Council of Ministers, outvoted in Parliament, doesn't matter what our own parties and our own members of Parliament who were elected by our people say. I mean, how is that a democracy?
The decision which the then British government under Margaret Thatcher took in 1986 to accept the most significant increase in the amount of majority voting decisions so far seen in the history of the European Union, was taken because of the argument then made within the Conservative government, notably by Malcolm Rifkin, who was the Europe Minister, was we have to decide, do we want simply to block everything, or do we want certain things to happen? If we want certain things to happen, then we have to take a risk that sometimes we will be outvoted, but on the belief that on a majority of occasions, as has actually been the case, we will be on the side of those voting through the legislation that is in the British national interest. That is the
point. If we had our own government, which would involve having treaties on various matters with other European countries, then it would be our government elected by the people of this country who would be deciding these matters, not the governments of other countries.
And that's do you agree with that? Just as a factual point, we would not have to agree over things. We'd be able to just do what we want.
It depends what view you take of sovereignty. I take a view of sovereignty, which is I want to be empowered to do the things which will benefit the interest of Britain. Now, the fact of the matter is that the nature of the institutional arrangements which Helen has just described were exhaustively discussed in Parliament back in 1972, before we joined. They were subsequently debated in the referendum in 1975, and no doubt they'll be debated again if we have another referendum in a year or two's time.
Mark Reckless.
So, Stephen, we had a referendum in 1975, but no one in this country under the age of 55 has had an opportunity to vote. Now, you talk about the EU as all about democracy, but if you look at it, it is an elite project, because Monnet, Schuman, the founding fathers knew that if they were honest about what they wanted, the people wouldn't vote for it. And every time it does go to a vote, whether in Denmark, France, the Netherlands, Ireland, twice, and that result goes the wrong way, it's ignored.
There have been, as you say, different results on different referendums. But if you look at public opinion polls in the majority of member states, there is still a majority among public opinion which is in favour of continued membership of the European Union, and interestingly, for those who are in the euro, of remaining within the eurozone.
But so ultimately, surely it should be the British people that decide. And in our country, the most recent opinion poll showed that 48% wanted to leave, 31% only wanted to stay in, and the rest didn't know. But almost every opinion poll taken in this country shows a majority who want to come out of the EU. Surely they should be allowed that choice.
But Mark Reckless, you're not making, it doesn't sound to me like you're making a statement relevant to the debate of whether we ought to be in or out. You're just saying we ought to have a choice, which is a different question.
No, what I would say is it's been an elite project. And Sir Stephen, who's made his career in the EU, and now Sir John Cunliffe, who has his position, they do deals not in public. And what we need to do is give you an incentive to actually negotiate a deal that might be in our interest, because you know ultimately it's going to a referendum.
You could argue that any project is an elite project insofar as governments come forward with proposals which they then have to get through Parliament. And as for these things being done in rooms in secret, people like me don't just kind of go into a room and say, I think this is what we'll negotiate. We are under instruction from ministers who have to go to Parliament and say this is our policy, defend it in Parliament, and ultimately secure a majority in Parliament to sustain it.
George Eustice.
Well, I think it would be churlish to deny that the European Union has had some achievements. And I would agree with Sir Stephen that, for instance, I think it played a part in helping be a bulwark in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And I think after the Berlin Wall came down, actually the European Union has played an important role bringing those East European countries into free trade areas. But there have undoubtedly been political costs as well, and there's no getting away from the fact that the EU has undermined democracy. And I think the most important thing is that the euro was a disastrous mistake. We now have, I think, a real problem and a threat to the stability of the European Union. That's why we need to think afresh about this. And I think that the dogma of ever closer union, this idea that you keep giving more and more power to the EU, is what's wrong with the European Union. We need to reverse that.
Yes, Stephen, I'm glad George raised that, because when you said it promotes stability, it doesn't always look like that at the moment.
Well, the situation in the Eurozone is certainly not a stable situation. But in a sense, it comes to the heart of my argument. I sat in Brussels for 5 years negotiating day in, day out with the other member states of the European Union. And the thing that constantly was in my mind was not that this is about to become a single state called Europe, but actually here we are, 15 at the time, ferociously nationalistic countries all fighting our corner. And if we didn't have some mechanism of managing that to prevent it getting out of hand, it could very easily get out of hand. I'm not talking about war, but take, for example, what happened a few years ago when the French refused to accept imports of British beef. You then have the European Commission taking the French to the European Court, and the European Court threatening to fine the French, and eventually the French came back into line. You have to have mechanisms short of tit for tat between individual countries to manage those relationships.
I think particularly when it comes to the single market, absolutely, you must have everybody signing up to that because everyone benefits from it. But this constant accumulation of power by the EU has been a mistake, and I do think it's a serious issue that we have at the moment, where we are effectively getting to the stage where the euro and democratic government are incompatible with one another. That's not a good place to be. What we actually need to do is really face up to this argument and recognise that there are times when it is better to have absolute control over a policy area, such as monetary policy, far better than that, than to have a seat at the table with 27 other people squabbling who can't agree.
Well,
That made your point very, very clearly, George, that you think they moved too far on too many issues, integrated too deeply. Stephen, do you at least concede that they must regret doing that and giving the European Union a kick by trying to renegotiate with a threat of exit would perhaps be a way of rebalancing it and reducing its scope to something more realistic?
Well, part of our problem in Britain is that we treat every issue as if it is a vital national interest, where actually what you have to do is prioritise what your interests are.
I think we've got to get away from this idea that it's an all or nothing when it comes to the European Union. There's already quite an element of pick and mix about it. We've got 27, soon to be 28 member states, only 17 of them are in the euro. We've got countries that are not in the Schengen agreement. We've got countries like Denmark who refuse to accept the authority of the European Court of Justice in areas such as justice and home affairs. So there are already quite a bit of flexibility. What I'm saying is that's the right principle. That principle of subsidiarity and flexibility in the EU, we should be expanding and building on that, not constantly undermining it with this argument that we have to have a seat at the table every time.
I'm interested in whether the rest of the panel agree with George that there's a pick and mix. You can pick and mix a little bit. What about you, Helen?
This is actually not viable. I mean, those treaties exist as they exist, and the single market, Mr. Stephen says himself, the whole point of the single market, we have this set of rules and they are imposed on everybody. Therefore, this idea that we can pick and mix those rules is just not viable.
I'm going to take a few questions from the floor. Gentleman at the back with his hand up there against the wall at the back. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Michael Climbs. I'm a journalist. I work for Digipress, the Japanese news agency. And my question regards David Owen, a former Foreign Secretary, who wrote a book recently, but came out a month ago, called Europe Restructured, where he was arguing for a two-tier speed Europe, single market, which Britain would be part of, and then a kind of stronger core, which have the euro. Do the panel think that Lord Owen's position and proposals make sense?
I'm glad you raised that, because in a way, maybe this in-out is just a little bit too binary. I wonder whether, have we framed this debate incorrectly, Sir Stephen?
Well, just to take Lord Owen's argument, first of all, he's removing or certainly diminishing the role of the institutions, namely the Commission, in terms of proposals for policy. So what do you have? Do you have a kind of free-for-all among the member states? Secondly, he wants basically to repatriate what are now European competencies, and those, frankly, are unnegotiable. You have to decide where your fundamental interests lie, and then decide where you can find some friends and allies to make the changes you want to make.
Mark Reckless wants to disagree.
And the problem about this is that the European Union is based on the concept of the acquis communautaire. Basically, once the EU has done something in any field, that is forever an area of EU control. And all we see is power going in an ever closer union towards the European institutions, and power is never returned to the member states.
Very quick one from George, and one more question from
I disagree with this defeatism coming from both sides, if I might say so. You know, we have to face the fact that Europe is now in a real crisis. This is an opportunity to remodel it and sort it out. And I think David Owen's absolutely right. There's an opportunity here to perhaps even bind Norway, Turkey, other countries like that closer to the UK within an outer tier within the European Union in a way that benefits them and benefits the EU, and actually, frankly, also gives a line of retreat for countries that might decide to exit the euro and join that outer tier. Where there's a political will, there's a way, and all this rubbish about treaties, if you decide something politically, you bring the lawyers in, you give them their marching orders, and they'll sort the treaties out.
But the outer tier existed before we joined the European Union. We were part of it, and it was unsatisfactory because it was too weak, both economically and politically.
But that's not what David Owen's talking about. He's talking about a different type of outer tier.
But he is basically talking about taking Britain out of what is now the mainstream of the European Union, and I believe in terms of loss of influence both within Europe and beyond Europe, that would be damaging to British interests.
Well, what's interesting is that actually you disagree with George on that, and I think, Helen, you disagree with George as well.
I was just going to say that the four of us agree on this matter, that this cannot be done. George is the only one who seems to think that somehow or other the treaties can be taken apart and we can put them all together again and get 27 as of next year. 28 countries agree. The difference is that Sir Stephen takes this slightly defeatist view that, well, it can't be done, we may as well go along with it. And the rest of us think, Well, it can't be done. Therefore, let's look to the future and have a completely different relationship.
Roger, quick
Can I
comment.
just add a quick point on that? I wouldn't argue that renegotiation was necessarily impossible, but you'd want a government with massive determination and self-confidence, and absolutely you'd have to back it up with a threat of leaving. And of course our Prime Minister has just declared that he will never campaign to leave, so he's given away the only negotiating card that might have effected a renegotiation.
Well, he's probably wisely calculated that it's not that much of a negotiating card. If you want,
I'm going to take one more from the floor. I'm going to take just one more from the floor. There's a gentleman in a white shirt right in the middle of that row there. He's looking very enthusiastic.
My name is Ragnar. I'm a student here at the LSE, and I was wondering whether the panel sees a parallel between the possibility of British interests being outvoted by the rest of Europe and Scottish interests being outvoted by the rest of the UK. And
Tell us where you're from. Where are you from?
I'm German.
You're German.
I'm sorry. I'm European.
It's a fair question, and I'm going to let Roger. I think you must accept that. The argument for Scottish independence and UK.
It's a very good question, congratulations, sir. And it brings up the vital point that there is more about democracy than just counting votes. Counting votes is purely arithmetic. Underlying a democracy, you must have Greek word demos. You must have a people who broadly consent to be governed together. But it is absolutely clear that no such demos exists in Europe, where we have different cultural traditions, speak different languages, and therefore the common public opinion necessary for representative democratic government simply cannot exist. So thank you for asking the question. I think it makes my point.
Right, we've had a good deal of argument on politics. We've talked about influence, we've talked about peace, we've talked about democracy, but of course the big action at the moment is in the subject of economics. At its narrowest, there's the issue of what we pay into the EU. At its broadest, it's about who we trade with, how we pay our way in the world. So what, against the background of everything that's going on, is the economic case for staying in? Let's have the second half now. Stephen, you lead us on.
well, as we've already said, we have a market of 500 million people, the world's biggest economy. It is a customs union. We can freely export our goods within it, and we do so to the tune from Britain of £100 billion worth each year. We play a major part in deciding the rules, and access to that single market has helped make us one of the most attractive places for inward investment, and the European Union accounts for well over half of the UK's overseas investment. The European Union uses its combined influence to secure trade deals bilaterally with other countries and through the World Trade Organization. And we can stand up to would-be protectionist action against us, for example, the kind of action that the United States wanted to take against our steel exports a few years ago, and against others with similar protectionist intent. Outside, we would immediately face tariff barriers, 10% on cars, so you have to ask yourself, would Honda or Nissan or BMW, would they find it economical to continue to base their production here? Of course, it's been mentioned, we could have a deal like Norway, but Norway pays for the privilege of access to the single market legislation over which they have no say whatsoever. And they have to implement whatever the 26, and we would have to implement whatever the 26 without us would decide, including the social legislation which some in this country so dislike. Or we could have a Swiss model with no participation in decisions or protection against new trade barriers and no access to the EU financial services market. So we would give up our representation, our votes and our influence for a deal which would allow us, in much less favourable conditions than now, to obey rules decided by 26 other countries. In my view, that is not a deal that a British government should want to accept.
Thank you very much. It's amazing you didn't mention the euro at all in that, which is obviously...
Well, I only had 90 seconds.
Yeah. I'm going to unleash Mark Reckless on you, first of all.
So Steve, the car industry is not a bad example. What you talk about is influence, but you're saying, influence over the rules of the market to which we export only a minority and a declining share of our exports. But in return for that, we have to apply those same rules to our larger exports outside and to the far larger domestic economy. Surely we should just obey their rules in return for making our own decisions nationally in a democratic way and regulating and making rules for our economy in a way that makes economic sense for us.
I don't accept the premise that these rules are against our interests. Margaret Thatcher wouldn't have accepted to do it that way if that had been her view, and the record shows that actually we've won far more of the arguments and the legislation than lost within the European Union. Secondly, I don't regard a 10% tariff barrier on cars or a 3% tariff barrier overall as insignificant. These things are very significant.
Right.
And I think in terms of opening up world markets, what happens if you have a World Trade Organization gathering? You've got the BRICS countries, Brazil and so on, going along and arguing their corner. You've got the Canadians and Australians arguing theirs. You've got the United States arguing theirs. You've got the European Union, and then you've got Britain. How much say would we have in those circumstances? The answer is very little.
We seem to have an almost uniquely pro-European audience in this hall, but may I just say that we are the second...
Maybe it's the force of my argument.
We are the second largest services exporter in the world. And so, Stephen, as you were saying, there is very little trade of services within the EU, and it hasn't been a priority. And still more, it hasn't been a priority when the EU negotiates external trade deals. And if we were able to set our own policy, we could use our market here, which we'd be able to either trade freely or to negotiate access to when it was no longer controlled by the EU, to open up external markets for our services that we can't when we're in the EU.
There is kind of an assumption that social legislation from Europe is a bad thing. Would you want to be an agency worker with no parental leave rights, no holiday rights, no pension rights? That was the British law before the European Union legislated that.
Reckless. But surely, Sir Stephen, wherever you stand on that, the issue should be one for democratic decision. And if people in this country want certain laws, surely they should be able to elect members of parliament who can pass those laws and kick those MPs out if they don't like it. It should be democratic.
Mark Reckless, that point is well made, but I want to ask you a question. If we abandon the social regulation that you don't like, we would not have the same access to the European market that we currently do. What we can't have is we pick and mix, we trade into Europe, but we abandon all the rules that Europe sets for trade. You agree with that?
The worst case scenario is that we compete on WTO, World Trade Organization rules, and we have to pay the common external tariff, which is about 4% now for the EU. We export about 130 billion odd per year of goods there, so that would cost about 5 or 6 billion pounds. It is a fraction of just what we pay into the EU budget.
So, well, it's not a fraction, that's a very good fraction of what we pay into the EU budget. But would you agree with that basic premise, Stephen? I just want to be quite clear about this, that we could, worst case, export to the EU with our own regulatory system on WTO rules with a small tariff on what we export.
Well, it comes back to the point whether those who are doing the exporting would actually regard that as simply a competitive hit that we could take.
Helen.
The assumption that this is all just about trade, I thought this section was about economics. Economics is a great deal more about trade. It involves the common agriculture policy, which is definitely not in our favour, the common fisheries policy, which is anything but in our favour, and a number of other things. The point about single market, and this cannot be emphasised strongly enough, it's not just about trade. It is about regulations that come in, and it applies to the entire economy of this country, not just the 8% of it that trades with the other European countries. It applies to all of it. And it's no good saying, well, we have some say in it, because we are easily outvoted on matters that are important to us, such as the financial sector, and it comes in. That's it. Whether we actually trade with the European Union on these matters or not.
Well, quick retort.
Well, take financial services. At a time when financial services legislation was first being mooted in Brussels, we had, through the city and more generally, a huge amount of influence on the shape of that legislation. But you have to be prepared to engage, get in at the very beginning, and you can then shape it.
Okay, I want to have Roger now.
I must come back on this, yes. So Stephen is telling us about agency workers and whether they're happier now. I can tell you, I followed that on the Unemployment Committee in the European Parliament. I saw a Labour minister pleading with Brussels apparatchiks for Britain to be let off that regulation. Would agency workers be happier under the old system? Yes, because under the old system, something like 50% of them got back into full-time jobs through having done agency work. Today, they're likely not to get an agency job at all because agency jobs have become much scarcer. Can we dismiss the cars 10%? Do we really imagine that with the number of Mercedes and Audis and BMWs that we import in this country from Europe, we would not reach a free trade deal on cars? Of course we would. But the real point I want to challenge Stephen on, he does something that Europhiles always do. He says, well, we could be like Norway or we could be like Switzerland. Stephen, we are one of the top 10 countries by GDP, top 5 countries in the world by trade, and yet you compare us to 2 small countries under the thumb of Brussels. Please, compare us to America, compare us to Japan, compare us to Korea. No, great independent nations. If we left the European Union, as I'm sure we will sooner or later, we too would have a free trade agreement. We would get most of the benefits of access to the single market, while we would avoid virtually all of the costs. And that is why I believe in economic terms we would be better off out.
Let's sort that out. Let's just sort that out, Stephen. Do you agree it would be possible to negotiate a free trade deal with the EU on the sorts of terms that Roger is talking about?
I do not believe that we would be able to negotiate that deal without there being a cash price to be paid for it.
Mark Reckless, very briefly.
The key point is we are the European Union's largest export market, and they export far more to us than we export to them.
And are you proposing that we would impose import restrictions on European Union goods if they didn't play ball in the negotiation?
It's ridiculous to say we couldn't negotiate a free trade agreement without paying them some huge bribe for it when they sell more to us than we sell to them, and we're their largest market.
The truth is that if you look narrowly at the position of our trade with Europe, then the current arrangement is better than the alternatives. It's better than what Norway's got, because they accept about 75% of EU laws but don't have a say in them. And it's better than what Turkey has, because Turkey, for instance, is in the customs union, unlike Norway, but it's not in the single market. And the single market is important to Britain's financial services industry, and the customs union is important to Britain's manufacturing industry. However, where Stephen's absolutely wrong is to turn a blind eye to some of the costs of our membership, the economic costs, and the burden of social and employment legislation and general laws that spew out of the European Union on a weekly basis isn't something that you can just turn a blind eye to. The Agency Workers Directive is a very expensive thing for British industry at a time when we're struggling to come out of a recession. The Working Time Directive costs the National Health Service about £3 billion a year. And then you've got the issue of the EU budget, and it's inexcusable that the EU still pays to have 2 parliaments and trucks everything down to Strasbourg 2 or 3 days a month. And it's inexcusable that their accounts haven't been signed off for some 15 years due to fraud and corruption. And we've got to tackle these things, and I think we do need to drive change in the European Union by freezing their budget, so that you drive change and get them to cut their cloth like everybody else in the world is having to.
George, these are not decisions of ours. We don't decide
you're
what
wrong.
Parliament is. We don't decide what the budget is.
So you're wrong.
We have to agree that with 27 other members.
No, that's absolutely wrong. The long-term budget is decided in the Council of Europe, which requires unanimity. Britain has a veto on the budget. And I think it's absolute nonsense to say that the Agency Workers Directive and Working Time Directive are an integral part of the single market. They're not. They're social legislation that's separate from the single market.
But do you think they would let us have different social regulation and have the same access that we currently have to their market?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I
think they'd let us undercut them on the social bit while having access?
Yes, I do, because I think others will want to reduce that as well. Well, Britain's not alone here. There are bits that other countries would like to get rid of, and we can trade. You get rid of what you don't like, we'll get rid of what we don't like.
Trade-offs on individual bits of legislation are part and parcel of the normal toing and froing of day-to-day EU business. There's nothing wrong with that, but I don't agree that what are now the fundamentals of EU law, including the social legislation, would be so easily set aside in the way that you suggest.
I want to just ask you a question, Steve, because I don't want us to forget the euro. I mean, you're not in favour of us joining the euro now, are you? Or right?
No, I'm not. But
you were, though. You were.
Yes, I mean, at the time that the 1999, when the euro came into force, I didn't do it out of kind of woolly idealism. I did it because I believed, wrongly as it turned out, that those countries would coordinate their economic policies across the board much more closely and intensively than actually happened. But I think the position that was taken by the John Major government is the right position. That there is no cost to Britain in having a situation in which we are free to stay out, but we keep the right to go in. We don't know. None of us can know what will happen in the Eurozone. And it might be, it might not be in 10 years' time, that actually a government of the day might think, well, in economic terms, maybe it is in our interest, at which point we have not, by leaving, abrogated the right to do so without paying a price for doing so.
And the fact that there will be, or that now seems quite possible there'll be an inner core and an outer periphery. Which bit would you really like us to be in? Deep down, you'd rather we were in the inner bit with the fiscal, monetary and banking union?
That is my personal conviction. But whichever bit you're in, as it were, and realistically we're going to be on the outer bit for the foreseeable future, what you have to do is engage in a realistic and serious and positive negotiation. What is our interest at the moment? Our interest is not to see that single market which we've fought to achieve become undermined because there's a separate set of rules being made by a core group of countries. That means we should be engaging in a negotiation with our partners to seek now to achieve that.
All right. Skeptics, I haven't heard much from you about the desire to grow the relationship with the rest of the world outside the EU. I mean,
that is critically important. I mean, we're constantly hearing that we do 50% of our export of goods to the European Union. Actually, it's nearer 42, 43%. But the European Union is less than 20% of global trade. So for me, the 40%, 42% figure is not a measure of how well we're doing in Europe. It's how we've become engaged in this inward-looking protectionist economic bloc, and we have failed to exploit opportunities in China, in India, in the Americas, in the parts of the world that are growing, because the European Union is in long-term relative economic decline. Its share of world trade and world GDP is continuously going down. Why do we in Britain want to focus our attention exclusively or primarily on a bloc which is in long-term relative decline? That's a serious issue.
Okay, a couple more interventions from the floor.
Okay. Good evening. My name is William Wong. Given that we are not likely to join the euro anytime soon, what in real practical terms, in terms of influence, do we have in this low ling anyway?
Thank you for that. I slightly wonder whether the whole events in the EU are making this debate a much less important one than it used to be, because effectively they are moving off into a second tier, a core. We're not in that core. Their interest is so big. I mean, this is the point at which the damage they can do to themselves or to the rest of the world is so large that our little national interest is not even going to factor for 3 minutes in the Eurozone as they try and get out of this, is it? I mean,
I think it does mean, Evan, that the crisis in the EU is so large that this is an opportunity for change. And so all those defeatists who say, oh, you just have to do what they want and go along with it, I think are wrong.
I don't know, do you think that the Germans are going to really think that the British concerns with the
absolutely, they will.
The working time directive is the big issue in Europe at the moment?
The German government already is starting to recognise this fact, because the truth is that Germany shares a lot of Britain's outlook when it comes to liberalising the single market, for instance, which France doesn't share. So Germany actually wants Britain there as an ally, as do many other countries. The answer is we can do this, we can, and we just have to stop being so insecure and defeatist about it.
Quick one, Mark Reckless.
So Stephen's argument for being in the EU seems to be that we have a great deal of influence there, and I'm not sure that we do. We have 8% of the votes, and he says that if we weren't in the EU, we'd have to obey their rules anyhow. But we'd only have to do that on the small and declining proportion of our exports that go to the EU. We'd be able to trade freely with the rest of the world, and we'd be able to run our own economy and our interests again.
Helen, I'd like to get your comments on this issue about whether the changes that are occurring in Europe at the moment, or seem likely to occur, mean this whole issue is less important than it used to be.
Well, it can be less important as long as we're in the EU and we have to obey the rules. In order to renegotiate or change a little bit of here and there, we actually have to take the treaties apart and start all over again. May I just add that all these arguments about how we wouldn't have any influence and we wouldn't have any say in the matter and everybody would leave us and we would not be able to trade if we were out of the EU, every single one of them was used in 1999 about the euro. If we don't go in the euro, we will lose all influence, we will have no direct investment, we will not have this, we will not have that. They were wrong then, they are wrong now.
Okay, we've battled through the politics, we've battled through the economics. The arguments have been, if you like, steered towards liberal markets, free trade, single markets, making capitalism work in Europe. I want to say one last question from someone here who is positively left-wing and who does not like the way any of these people are talking. Even Stephen is accepting that free trade is a good thing. Have we got someone who is much more left-wing from a pro or an anti perspective? In the blue shirt there, yes, sir.
Well, I'm totally opposed to the EU, and I think we should get out of it as soon as possible. But I'm not opposed to it for the same reason as that bunch of Tories up there, that bunch of right-wing liberals.
We're not Tories.
We're not Tories.
Let's hear the argument. Let's hear, because you're going to give us a sceptical argument, and I'm interested in this from another perspective.
Well, all you've got to do is look at what's happening in Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Ireland. Countries that have been decimated, their economies have been destroyed, their workers have been made unemployed, they've been told they're going to face austerity measures maybe for decades. You've got no solutions, you support capitalism, we want something different, and it's nothing to do with what you've got to offer. Out of the EU, a socialist Europe.
Right. aren't you glad you asked?
So, I wanted us to have a different and alternative perspective, and we got that. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for that. Now, it has become very obvious through the course of this debate that this is not a balanced audience or representative opinion in the country, which, as we say, is somewhat sceptical of membership of the EU. At the beginning, you were overwhelmingly pro. So what I'd like you to do is going to do the same thing as before. We're going to do the shout test and the show of hands. Those of you who, at the end of the debate, having listened to the arguments, are in favour of Britain remaining within the EU, shout yay. Yay! Those of you who are against, shout nay. Yay! Yays, put your hands up. Nays, put your hands up. I don't think it's changed one little jot at all. Stephen, just comment on the arguments that have been thrown at you. Because, in a way, everything hinges on the deal that we would get if we left, the deal we can negotiate if we stay in. That's what it's all about, isn't it? It's all contingent.
No, I don't think it is. I think fundamentally it is certainly about a view of British national interest, including economic interest. But I think you have to take a view of the state of the world and the things to which you attach importance. I personally, having lived throughout my life in Western Europe at peace, want to maintain that. And I do believe that spreading democracy around most of the European continent has been an important contribution to that. I believe that the soft power which the European Union exercises through its aid programs and its foreign policy is an important part of that. I don't believe that in terms of our domestic systems, our social welfare systems and so on, we have as much in common with the United States, let alone the Commonwealth, where 28 countries still have capital punishment, as we do with our European partners. We have more in common, I believe, in terms of British values with our European partners than with any other group of countries. If you have a view of Britain and what Britain stands for, I believe that is where we are most likely to continue to find the representation of our interests and our identity.
Let me say, at the end of that heated and interesting debate, thank you to Roger Helmer, Helen Szamuely, Mark Reckless and George Eustice. Thank you all panel for your points and questions, and thank you to Sir Stephen who had to battle against the panel. Thank you all.